up to mitzvah number 71, and today we're going to do 71, 395, 473, and 474, and 507. And again, this numbering system follows the mitzvos as they appear in the Torah. The Torah has 613 mitzvos, and we are going through them in the order in which they appear in the Torah. And today we're going to bunch together 5 related mitzvos, number 71, 395, 473, 474, and 507. And these are the mitzvos of tithing. We're told that when we have produce from the year, we have to give various tithes. There are tithes that go to the Cohen. There are tithes that go to the Levite. There are tithes that we eat ourselves in Jerusalem. There are tithes that go to the poor person. And finally, the 5th mitzvah, and that is that we have to follow a designated order, a protocol of how to give the tithes and what the order of the tithe giving is. And those are the mitzvahs that we want to do today. Now, as always, we're going to do just a sampling of some of the laws and some of the insights behind this mitzvahs. If you do the math, the amount of subject or the amount of Mishnah that deals with the laws of tithing is about 5% of all of Mishnah. So there is a vast amount of literature on this subject, but we're going to try and get a sample, a snapshot of the mitzvah, and to gain some literacy, as we always try to do here on the mitzvah. So let's start with mitzvah 507, which is the Truma to the Cohen. So you have your year's crops, and you have to disperse the tithes before you can eat the food. And from a Torahitic level, the tithes are oriented around a farmer. You produce wheat, or you plant wheat, or barley, or whatever it is, and after a year's worth of work, you finally reap your harvest, and you have to disperse the tithes before you can eat the food. Before the food is tithed, it's called untithed or tevel, and thus it is prohibited to eat. So the first tithe that has to be given out is the Truma to the Cohen, to the priest. And this, in fact, is one of the 24 gifts that are given to the Cohen. It's a great gig if you could get it. A Cohen is given all kinds of gifts from the Israelites, and one of them is that they get the Truma. The first tithing is given to the Cohen. And the Ramban points out that of the 24 gifts that are given to the Cohen, many of them are the first. So the first of your fruits, the bikurim, you give to the Cohen. The first of your produce, of your crops, you give to the Cohen. When you make a dough, you give the challah to the Cohen, the beginning. The first shearing of wool, you give to the Cohen. There's 3 parts of all sacrifices that are given to the Cohen: the cheek and the right foreleg and the stomach. And the Rambam points out that each one of these are the first of its kind, the first step that it takes, the first part of its face, the first part of the digestion system of the animal. All the first are given to the Cohen. And he explains that when you work hard and you produce something, that first thing, it's almost like you go to a store and they work so hard and they get all the certification and they do all the regulation, and finally they open up their restaurant and someone comes in and buys something and you have a dollar bill. And you take that dollar bill and you plaster it on the wall. It's kind of a strange thing. You go to a restaurant, you see they have the first dollar that we earned, because there's some immense pride that people have when they put in effort and it yields results, and that very first result is something that they have this deep, intimate connection with. And we're told that the first fruits, the first of your crops, the first shearing, that joy, you channel it to God. And therefore you give that first to his representative, and that is the Cohen. So you produce your crops and you are done, and now it's time to harvest. The first tithing you give is the Truma, and you give that to the Cohen. Well, how much do you have to give? What percentage of that? Tithe usually means 10%. In this context, the Truma is not 10%. It's 2%. We'll get to the 10% in a little bit. 2% you give to the Cohen. Now, the Mishnah tells us that 2% is 1/50th, and that's average. The average Truma is 2%. If you want to be very generous, you could give 1/40th to the Cohen. And if you want to be a little bit more skimpy, a little bit more miserly, you give 1/60th to the Cohen. But the bare minimum, the absolute minimum, is even one kernel. If you have an entire field and you take one kernel of wheat and you give that to the Cohen, of course it's not advised, average is 2%, but that is the bare minimum. It means you have to give something. As long as the first gift that you give, it could be the tiniest amount, you give that to the Cohen and you have fulfilled your obligation. But, of course, we are told that you're supposed to give around 2% on average. If you want to be a little bit more generous, 1/40th. Now, from a biblical perspective, the laws of Truma apply only to grain, wine, and oil. Rabbinically, anything that grows from the ground, anything that is human food, anything that the owner watches is obligated in Truma. But from a biblical perspective, it's only the three of grain, wine, and oil. And the Sefer Chinuch, the book that we're using to guide us through the mitzvos, he explains that these are the essentials. The essentials are grain, wine, and oil. And therefore, from a biblical perspective, it's important for someone to take the things that are essential to them and the first, and you dedicate that, you consecrate that to God and to his emissaries. And therefore, he explains that what's really happening over here is a person is supposed to, at the moment of their great joy, at their moment of their great pride, they've produced a yield. There's been crops. There's been something that is now the product, the fruits of their labor. At that moment, don't forget about God. Don't forget about his emissaries and consecrate that first little bit of your produce, consecrate that for God. And therefore, if you do only one kernel, you are already engaging in that exercise and you've already fulfilled the bare basic obligation. But the Almighty wants us to really have this idea penetrate home, to really think about the fact that all the blessings that I have are really from God, and the first of my fruits I'm supposed to dedicate towards him. And therefore, I would say you're supposed to give a minimum of 2%. If you want to be a little bit cheaper, it's 1/60th. A little bit more generous, it is 1/40th. You give it to the Cohen, and now it belongs to the Cohen. And what does the Cohen do with those products, with that crop? Well, they can eat it. But there's a whole set of laws governing how the Cohen eats it. It is what's called holy food. An Israelite is not allowed to eat it. In fact, by Torah law, if an Israelite eats Truma, they are liable to be executed in the eyes of God. Of course, it's not something that the Jewish court, the human court, metes out, but in God's eyes, it is an executable offense. You give it to the Cohen, and you have fulfilled your first tithing, the Truma, to the Cohen. Now, which Cohen gets it? What if you live in a city and there's hundreds of Kohanim? Or you live in the land and there could be thousands, tens of thousands of Kohanim. Which Cohen gets your Truma? The answer is, it's your choice. You could give to any Cohen in the entire world. It's up to you. You as the Israelite, you have the right to decide which Cohen receives your Truma. And the Talmud points out that there's room for some chicanery here. You can have a Cohen who says, I want to volunteer in your threshold. I want to volunteer as a farmhand on your field. I want to help you. And of course, he's trying to lobby you that you give your Truma to him. After all, you have to give it to a Cohen. So why not me? I'm going to be the one who volunteers in your field. And therefore, the Talmud says that a Cohen is not allowed to go and help or to get paid in Truma, it's a really bad look for a Cohen to do work in exchange for the Truma. It's supposed to be a gift given to the Cohen. It's not supposed to be a transactional. It's supposed to be entirely out of the goodness of your heart, 2% to the Cohen. Okay, so you've given your 2% to the Cohen. What now? Now you have the first tithe. In this instance, it is 10%. 10%, not to the Cohen, but to the Levite. Of course, a Cohen is a member of the tribe of Levi, but they're a family amongst the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron, and Aaron and his descendants exclusively. They're not part of the general, they're almost designated as a separate group amongst the Levites. When you give the 10%, the first tithing goes to Levites and not to the Cohen. And the Torah tells us that when they divided up the land of Israel, every tribe got a portion, with the exception of the tribe of Levi. God is their portion. They don't have land designated for them in the land of Israel. But when all of the other Israelites plant their fields and produce their crops, they give 10% to the Levite. And the commentaries here explain that the Levites, they represent the clergy. They're the ones who are always doing the bidding of the people, the spiritual bidding of the people. They are representing the nation. They are doing the work in the temple. And therefore, it's important for us, the Israelites, to sustain them with dignity. They, after all, don't have a portion, but everyone else is going to cover their expenses. And therefore, it's important for us as Israelites to pay for the Levites' expenses, and therefore we designate 10% of all of our produce to be given to the Levite. And the commentaries ask an interesting question. Well, the Levites are one tribe out of 12. And therefore, if it's fair, they don't have a portion of the land, and therefore we have to give them from our portion. But shouldn't we give them 1/12 of our crops, not 1/10? After all, they're 1/12, they're one tribe out of 12. So we should give them not 10%, but 8.3333%, which is the equivalent of 1/12 of 100%. Why are we giving them extra? So the Sefer Chinuch explains, he says, you're right. Mathematically, they deserve only 8.3 because they don't have a portion of the land of Israel, and therefore there is something that they deserve. But they're the Levites. These are the holiest people of our nation. This is the tribe that has designated themselves for worship of God, and we give them a little bit extra. And not only do they get 10%, they don't have to pay for any of the expenses. They just get free and clear 10% of all the crops, of all the wealth, of all the bounty produced by all of Israel. And the Sefer Chinuch tells us that if someone gives life and gives support to those who are God's emissaries, who are God's representatives, who are the clergymen, who are the Levites, there is a promise from God that they are going to have divine blessing. And he quotes a Mishnah, Ma'asros, Ma'aser, which is tithing. That's a way to ensure that you get wealthy. And he quotes the famous Talmud. The Talmud says that in all areas, we cannot test God. We have to just rely on him. We have to have faith. But there's one area we're allowed to test God, Aser, Ta'aser. You should surely tithe, says the Talmud. What that means is you should tithe in order that you should become wealthy. And this is the only area we're allowed to test God. Every other area, you have to rely on faith. Now, I would be remiss if I did not mention the very famous Ramban, where he talks about the Levites. And he asks the question, why are the Levites different? Why don't they have a portion of the land of Israel? Why don't they get part of the booty, part of the plunder of the conquest of Israel? And he explains, because they were designated to worship God and to be teachers, to teach Torah and laws to the masses. And therefore, they are removed, they are designated from the rest of the people. They don't engage in warfare, they don't inherit any of the land, and they do not earn, so to speak, with their own strength. Rather, they are the army of God. And then the Rambam continues, and this is not limited to the tribe of Levite. Rather, every human, he doesn't say Jew, he says every human of all the people in the world whose heart is inspired and understands of their knowledge to designate themselves and to stand before God, to worship God, to serve, be of service of God, and they go in a straight path, the way the Almighty wants, and they remove from their neck the yoke of any other calculation besides to do the will of God, behold, this person becomes consecrated in the highest level of holiness. And God is their portion, and God is their inheritance, and they will merit both in this world and in the next world. They, in this world, will be taking care of God like the Levites and the Kohanim, and of course, their reward is complete for them in the world to come. I know this is a very controversial subject, but the moral and religious argument to exempt yeshiva students from the army is this idea. The idea that with the Levites, we are described, or we are told about a tribe that's designated for God, and that is their job. And because that's their job, the responsibilities, the other earthly, terra firma responsibilities are removed from them, and consequently, everyone else has to take care of them. And therefore, they're not responsible to go to war, and our responsibility as Israelites is to uphold them and to sustain them. Now, unlike the Truma given to the Cohen, the 10% tithing given to the Levite is not holy. It can be eaten by all, provided that the Levite actually gives his tithing. And this is where it gets a little confusing. We give 2% to the Cohen, and we give 10% to the Levite, and the Levite himself has to give 10% of his 10% to the Cohen. But once the Levite has tithed from his tithing, that food is completely permissible to anyone, even to regular Israelites, unlike the Truma, which can only be eaten by the Cohen and his family and his household. So some more laws over here that are very pertinent. You can only confer tithing from produce onto produce of the same year and the same type. So if I have wheat and barley, I can't give 10% of the entirety of all the grain and cover the tithing. I have to give 10% of the barley for the barley, 10% of the wheat for the wheat, etc. Moreover, there is a year. It follows a fiscal year system. The bounty, the product, the yield of this year covers the yield for this year. I cannot tithe from something old on this year, something new on last year, etc. Now, when does something become tithable? This is very complicated laws. There's various different stages. When something becomes edible, when something becomes processed, when something is harvested, and the final stage of the development of the fruit to make it tithable is when you actually bring it into your house. And when you bring it into the house, all the laws of tithing actually apply. And there's no way to avoid tithing before you can consume it. Whereas in earlier stages of the development of the fruit, you can take a snack before you tithe it. It's not fully consecrated as being primed for tithing. Now, the Talmud gives an interesting loophole, which when I was researching this, I was like, oh, I remember studying that like 15 years ago because it is so surprising and so interesting. It's kind of hard to forget. It's quite memorable. The final stage of making something tithable is when it sees the face of the house, which means it comes into the house. You bring your grain into the granary, you bring it to your house, and now it's yours, and you're going to eat some of it, you're going to sell some of it. You've completed all the work needs to be done in the field. Everything has been completed. Now it's indoors. But the way it's described is that it sees the face of the house. It enters the threshold. It crosses over from outside the house to inside the house. So the Talmud says that there's a loophole. If you have a skylight, if you have a hole in your roof, and you take your grain and you don't bring it into the house, into the door, but you drop it through the roof. It never crosses over the threshold. And therefore, it would actually not be obligated to be tithed. So there's a loophole. It's like you could set up your 501. You could set up your. It's like you could set up your C corp in like Bermuda. You've heard of those things. The whole company runs from some PO box in Ireland or something like that. Apparently, there's loopholes here for tithing as well. Now, if a Levite owns a field, they too are obligated to tithe. They must give to a different Levite. They are not exempt from tithing. This law, of course, is only applicable in the land of Israel. This law, of course, only applicable in the land of Israel. So those are the first two tithings that we have to give. The Truma, 2% to the Cohen. The Meiser, the first tithing, which is 10% to the Levite. There's at least two more tithings that we need to talk about on this same crops. Because, of course, there's tithing for animals, and there's all kinds of tithing. But we're talking about specifically tithing for produce. The next tithing is what's called the second tithing. Another 10%. And that's 10% that you get to keep, provided that you eat it in Jerusalem. I've given my 2% to the Cohen. I've given my 10% to the Levite. They don't belong to me anymore. I take another 10%, and that's mine. And I take those fruits, I bring it with me to Jerusalem, and when we have the pilgrimage, multiple times a year we go to Jerusalem, I eat my own fruit, my own product in Jerusalem. Well, what if it's a lot? It's, how am I going to carry all these bushels of wheat? What you do is you sell the wheat or the grapes or the fruits of whatever type, of whatever type. You sell it in your local town, and that money you bring to Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, you buy food, and that food is the second tithing. And the law is that when you convert your crops into money, you have to add a fifth on top of that. And the idea here is as follows. The center of Jewish life is the temple. It's Jerusalem. That's where the Sanhedrin is. That's where the seat of our religious life is. 3 times a year, we're obligated to go to Jerusalem on the 3 festivals. Moreover, throughout the year, when we need an inspiration, when we need a little boost, we go to Jerusalem. And by designating 10% of our income to be spent in Jerusalem, that forces us to go to Jerusalem. And when we go there, to have a memorable experience, to buy lots of food and to spend a lot of money even, and to make it as memorable as possible. And therefore, the Torah tells us 10% of your income is a tithe. It's a tithe you don't have to give away. It's yours, you and your family, your children, your household. You eat it in Jerusalem. It is sacred food. You could make it easier by converting it into money and spend money in Jerusalem. But that's a way to keep the Jewish people connected, to keep the Jewish people connected with the rest of their brethren, with the rest of their co-religionists, with the Sanhedrin, which is in Jerusalem, with the temple, to make it part of the Jewish way of life. And as a result of that, we'll always be connected to the rest of our people, we'll be connected to Torah, and we'll be united as a nation. That's the second tithe. And then you have what's called the tithe for poor people. And the way this is done is that the Jewish agrarian calendar runs on a 7-year cycle. Every 7th year we have Shemitah, which is a year that we're not allowed to do any work in the field, and that year we're not obligated on any tithes. So year 1 and year 2, the second tithe is mine, and I eat it in Jerusalem. On year 3, I don't have the second tithe go to me to be eaten in Jerusalem. The second tithe is called the tithe of the poor, and I give that 10% to the poor. And then again, 4 and 5, the second tithe is eaten by me and my family in Jerusalem. And year 6, instead of the second tithe, we have the tithe for the poor people. It is an interesting question. If 2/3 of the time that second 10% is eaten by me, and 1/3 I give to the poor person, why don't we just have it every year, 2/3 of that 10% be eaten by me and 1/3 given to the poor person? It's an interesting question to be ruminated upon. So that's the basic tithing schedule. When you have your 100 bushels of wheat, 2% goes to the Cohen, 10% goes to Levite. Another 10% you have to give away. Who do you give away to? Depends. Year 1, 2, 4, and 5, that 10% you have to give it to yourself, provided you eat it in Jerusalem. Once you walk into the city of Jerusalem, you cross over the gate of the city, you can eat it in Jerusalem, provided you are ritually pure. Or you can convert it into money and bring the money to Jerusalem and eat from the food that you buy with that money in Jerusalem. That's year 1, 2, 4, and 5. Years 3 and 6, I take that 10% and I give it to the poor person, and that belongs to the poor person. That's the basic overview of the laws of tithing from a biblical perspective. And mitzvah number 71 is the mitzvah that says we have to follow the pre-designated order. First, the Cohen gets his Truma, then the Levite gets his tithing, the first tithing, and then the Levite himself has to give 10% of what he got, and then we have depends. And then we have the extra 10%, and it depends on what year we're talking about. Years 1, 2, 4, and 5, it's the Meiser Sheni, the second tithing, I bring to Jerusalem, and years 3 and 6, that 10% goes to the poor person. Now, what is the reason why we have to follow this designated protocol, this sequencing? First you do this, and then you do that. So the Sefer Chinuch says something really interesting. He says these laws are quite intricate. And the second you start to tamper with it, you're going to make mistakes. And because this is something which is so critical to the upholding of our religion, it's important to do it properly, to follow the pre-designated order, to not tamper with any of the details of this process. I think this is an important lesson for us. With matters of charity, we sometimes like to ballpark things. Well, I don't know, if I take something from the shul or I take something from the charity, well, I'll make up for it. I'll give a little extra next time or something like that. We don't do that. We try to follow protocol to be as precise as possible with matters of charity. Now, the final item here that I want to talk about is what about today? Most of the laws that relate to the land of Israel are applicable only during the times of the temple. We don't have a temple, and therefore, do we have these laws today or not? We do have agriculture in the land of Israel, but we don't have a temple. So it's a huge discussion in the commentaries, but everyone agrees that these laws, in fact, do apply today. The only question is, are these of biblical severity or are they of rabbinic severity? But everyone agrees that halacha maintains that these laws are still extant today. The problem is that we cannot give the Truma to the Cohen today or to the Levite. We can't give the tithing to the Levite. And therefore, we have to designate the Truma and the Meiser, the Truma, the various tithes, but we cannot give it to the Cohen. The Cohen cannot eat it when he's ritually pure. The whole idea of purity and impurity is something that is, of course, very foreign to us. But today, we just assume everyone and everything is impure. And therefore, we have to designate it, but we cannot fully implement it, fully actualize it. And therefore, this creates another interesting law with relation to what can we eat and what can we not eat. If you grow fruits or vegetables or grain in the land of Israel, that grain may be identical to the grain you'd grow in Kansas, but one of them will be considered kosher and perfectly edible right away, the one made in Kansas, and one of them will be considered unkosher, inedible, until you separate the Truma and the Meiser, Truma, the various tithes. And ironically, something grown in the land of Israel, we would think, oh, it's holy, it's the land of Israel, it's great, support Israeli farmers. Unless the tithing was done, it is considered unkosher. It is like tevel, it's prohibited to be eaten until the tithing has been done. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, I got an email from one of the rabbis in town who said that there are bell peppers that come from Israel being sold in various United States groceries. And therefore, typically, you look at kosher products, you want to make sure it's got the OU or whatever symbolize or whatever other kosher symbol that it may have to indicate kosher certification. But the fruits and vegetables, it's all kosher, right? There's no animal products in it. It's kosher, unless it comes from Israel. If it comes from Israel, it needs certification, and therefore you have to be aware of that as well. Now, my wife told me yesterday when I was researching this, when she was in school in Israel, she was invited by some non-Shabbat and she was invited by some non-Torah observant family to come for a party by their house. And they said, don't worry about it, everything's gonna be 100% kosher. But you can't explain to someone who has no idea of the laws of tithing that, well, your fruits and vegetables are actually not kosher because it was not certified as being kosher. So she had to research the laws of how to separate the truma, the various tithings, herself before she got there. You have to designate part of, let's say, your bowl of strawberries. You have to designate part of it to be considered part of the tithe. And you can't deliver it to the Cohen or the Levite. You have to actually throw it in the garbage. We have to say certain things ahead of time. So she actually did this. She said she went, kind of inconspicuously to the kitchen. No one was watching her, so she's able to say the blessing, to designate the Truma and the Meiser, to designate the tithing, and to discard of that particular fruit in accordance with the laws of Truma Meiser, the laws of tithing that are still applicable today. So that is a brief overview of these mitzvos. We went through 5 different mitzvos, the 4 different tithes that are relevant to the field and the produce, and the 5th mitzvah that we must follow the proper protocol, do what's first, what's second, and so on. First the Truma to the Cohen, then the first tithing to the Levite, and then the next 10%, it depends. Year 1, 2, 4, and 5, it is yours. The second tithe you bring to Jerusalem. Years 3 and 6, that 10% is given to the ani, to the pauper. And I'm going to pause for questions before we start the next Mishnah in Pirkei Avos.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so if somebody is like using the thing where they drop their food through the hole in the roof, are they really going to have God's blessing when they're trying to avoid blessing the Levite?
No.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting thing. I just love the image of someone cutting a hole in their roof and dropping it just to avoid giving the tithing. They have enough fear of God to say that I don't want to violate the law, but they don't want to fulfill the spirit of the law either, right?
Right.
Then who pays for the hole in the roof?
Also, I guess it depends, how much grain you have.
Right.
Now, I thought you could sell part sell part of it, take the money, and if you couldn't get to Jerusalem, you sold the grain and the product and took the money and gave it.
Yeah, that would be for the second tithing.
No.
Now, just to your point, Terry, if someone wants to follow this loophole, they could do it, but the Torah warns us that in the event that someone refuses to give the tithing, even if they do it in a kosher fashion, they will end up with the tithing. The verse says that you have 100%, 100 units, and you don't want to give 10% to the Cohen, and you don't give 10% to the Levite. You want to use all this chicanery, all these loopholes to avoid giving it. You will end up with that 10%, but you're going to lose the other 90%. So it's a great loophole, but it's probably bad advice.
Does a person choose which Levite to give to, like they do?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I have one more question.
Yes, go ahead.
You said that when you're a farmer, let's see, you said something about the cheek, about giving the.
Yes.
Okay, I didn't think would cheek be kosher? Wouldn't that still have blood in it? I always thought that any meat in the head had blood in it because it wouldn't drain properly.
No, there are ways to get rid of the blood, from what I understand. To salt it properly, get rid of all the blood.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you.
I'm told it's a great delicacy. I don't know. Is that true? People like eating brains. They call it showbreads, which is ridiculous.
It is. They call it in Spanish, and amongst Hispanics, it's a great, it's very good. The cheek meat.
But if they called it cow brain, I don't think it would sell as well.
Well, not the brain. I was thinking a lot of people do eat brains, but I was thinking about the cheek meat.
Barbacoa.
Barbacoa, yeah, it's delicious.
Well, excellent. Good for the Cohen.
Yeah, all I want is somebody to call it bread something before you serve it to me, so I won't know.
I have a quick question about is there any scenario where if there were Noahide people who were involved in agriculture in the land of Israel when there was a temple, would any of these laws apply to them, or is that not?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think it would apply to them. I don't think it would apply to them. And actually, this is not our subject, but with respect to the laws of Shemitah, Shemitah means no Jews allowed to do any work in the field in the land of Israel for the seventh year, for the duration of the seventh year. And one of the ways around this is to actually consign the land to the non-Jew. And if the non-Jew owns it, well, they're allowed to do work there. So that might be quite helpful, actually. When there's non-Jews that own part of the land, and they're not obligated by the laws of Shemitah, it's not part of the 7 Noahide laws, and therefore we could buy from them, and we could, forestall starvation. Now, today, of course, it's much easier to import and export, but that was one of the ways that they solved this problem. They would want to keep Shemitah, but they would also want to eat food, and it wasn't so easy to import grain from Nebraska. So if it's owned by a non-Jew, that's one of the workarounds to the Shemitah problem.
But isn't one of the purposes of the Shemitah to give the land rest?
Yes, that is true. So again, you're right. It's a loophole, but again, provided that we are not violating the law, it's okay. People either love loopholes or hate them. I love talking about them because they're interesting. Steve, what are you saying, Steve?
Just taking it in.
We couldn't understand you.
I said I'm just taking it in. Just taking it in. I don't know
Okay.
if internet Weird connection there right now.
Okay, so can we take a 1-minute break before we start the Mishnah? Is everyone okay with that? Just a 1-minute break. I'll be back in a minute.
How's my fellow Torah scholars doing? There's John and Bobby Lee, Sandy, Charlie, Ross, Nicholas, Mary Lou, Bruce, Karen and crew, the Navarro family, Mark and Stephanie. Ooh, who else? Sonia, Albert, and Leslie Witkoff. Sorry I'm not showing my face. I'm a hot mess still. I'm going to go take my weekly shower today, so. Been bathing out of a bucket.
I'll tell you, my head is still spinning around about who to give to what. So I'm just going to go ahead and continue to make my donations, and that.
Yeah, well, no, I know. It's a little, I guess in the spirit of being generous and full of charity, we don't have a temple. I guess some of those things would be impossible to do now. That's why I was wanting to ask him, is it a moot point now without the temple, or in Israel, do people go to a Cohen that they know who's a teacher or whatever and give them something? So I don't know.
What gets me is I get letters galore every week about helping the poor people in Israel, and show some old lady going through a garbage bucket and what have you.
Right.
I'm shocked that there's such poor people in Israel.
Yes, I know. And look, you walk through the streets of Mershim and you see these Orthodox children begging for money, and mothers with their children begging for money. So it's not a happy thing. Now maybe it's just because it's all concentrated there in the city, but we don't really see too much of that where we're at here in this town. Occasionally you might find somebody on the street corner asking for money, and we try to help, but
Don't they have a soup kitchen type of arrangement over there?
yes, sir. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to help, that's actually the best way, is to donate to one of the soup kitchens. And they feed, what's really interesting is in the state of Israel, unique to just about any country, all of the extra produce in grocery stores and restaurants are donated. Their overages and things that they normally in the U.S. throw in the rubbish bin are given to these agencies to feed people. And they literally feed thousands of people a year with food donated from grocery stores and restaurants, et cetera. It's a brilliant idea. Kroger's just now started doing that, taking anything they'd normally put in the rubbish bin and donate it to the food bank.
Well, Rod, Trader Joe's has been doing that for years.
Yes,
In
yes, they
California,
have.
there's a number of places that have been doing that. So I give to the food banks a lot because I know that they distribute to. Yeah.
That's wise. I agree with you 100%. Same here.
Ham has arrangements, the Humble Area Ministries has arrangements with the local food services that things move to them.
Yeah, we absolutely contribute a lot to Ham. Great. Rabbi, ready when you are.
Yes. Okay, let us begin. So sorry about that. Okay. So we're going to do the next Mishnah Perkei Avos. If you have this, it's great. If make sure that you are muted so that we all have a pleasant listening experience. We are up to chapter 5, Mishnah number 1. It's such a joy to get to the 5th chapter of Perkei Avos, of chapters of our fathers. I'm going to read the Mishnah and we're going to discuss it. It's a very interesting Mishnah. Be'asara ma'amaros nivra ha'olam. With 10 utterances was the world created. Uma Talmud lomar. What's the lesson behind this? V'halo b'mamar echad yachal lihibaros. is it not that with one utterance it could have been created? Elali hiparim and ereshayim, to exact punishment from the wicked, who are destroying the world that was created with 10 utterances, and to give good reward upon the righteous who sustain the world that was created with 10 utterances. So this is going to be a pattern that we're going to see throughout the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos. Unlike the preceding 4 chapters, the majority of the teachings of this chapter are going to be unattributed. We're not going to say, oh, Rabbi so-and-so taught such and such. And it's going to be dealing with a lot of bigger picture ideas, a lot of very Kabbalistic ideas, a lot of very broad ideas, I would say more general ideas. But I think it's going to be a very different style and probably a little bit more interesting as well. So this Mishnah tells us that the world was created with 10 utterances and not one. And the reason for this is so that way the wicked who destroy the world are going to be punished because they destroyed a world that has 10 utterances, and the righteous are going to be rewarded because they are upholding a world that was created with 10 utterances. So what does this mean? So just the very basic is that if you count in Genesis, how many times does it say, and God said, let there be light, let there be water, let there be animals, let there be a human, let us make man. If you count how many times it says that God made an utterance, God said something, it's 10. And therefore, this world was created with 10 utterances. Now, if you actually count them, it turns out that there's only 9 times in the Genesis narrative where it says that God said, let there be such and such. Yet the Mishnah tells us that the world's created with 10 utterances. So the Talmud answers that you're right. The world is created with 9 times it says, Vayomer, Hashem said such and such, God said such and such. But the 10th utterance was the very first word of the Torah, Bereshis, in the beginning. In the beginning is considered like it is its own utterance, and therefore, if you tally up the 9 times it says, and God said, plus Bereshis in the beginning, you have a total of 10 utterances, and that is how the world was created. Now, the obvious question is, why? Why do we have 9 utterances of one ilk and the 10th utterance of Bereshis, of in the beginning, a different kind of utterance? So this already brings us to some of the deep ideas that we're going to talk about in this Mishnah. The first creation is different than the ensuing creations. The first creation of Bereshis in the beginning is different than the ensuing 9 times it says, and God said, and he created. Why? Because when God created the first creation, what was the status of existence at the time when God made the first utterance? It was the domain of the infinite. Before they might create something finite, before he created time and space and matter and energy, before what we were called today the Big Bang, but of course the one that was orchestrated by God, before the initial creation of anything finite, you had just the world of infinite. And that world is something which is totally beyond us. And that world is very different than the ensuing creation, let there be light. Once there is already existence of the finite variety, that is a different world that we can associate with versus the world that we cannot associate with, the world of the infinite. And therefore, it's important to distinguish the two as being different. And more specifically, the nature of the first creation versus the second and the rest of the 10 creations are also different. The first creation is something out of nothing, what's called ex nihilo. There's no existence, there's no finite matter, there's no finite energy, there's no time, there's no space. It's just infinity. And then there's a creation, ex nihilo, something out of nothing. And what is the nature of the ensuing 9 utterances, the ensuing 9 creations? That is the Almighty taking what exists already and repurposing it and reformatting it and changing it into other things. In the beginning of the Torah, the comment of the Ramban in his commentary, he talks about the concept, and he gives it the Greek term hiuli, which is this matter and energy that can be reshaped and resized and reformatted into other things. Day 1 of creation. Creation number 1 is Bereshis, is in the beginning. Is this creation something out of nothing, matter where there was none, energy where there was none, time where there was none, space where there was none. That is Bereshis, one kind of creation. Everything else, Vayomer, and God said, and those are comparable. All the Vayomers are comparable because it's the Almighty taking what He already created and reshaping it. Whereas Bereshis is incomparable to any other creation, and therefore it has a different name. It's not Vayomer, and God said, it is Bereshis, this new creation, something out of nothing. So our Mishnah tells us that the creation happened with 10 utterances. But it could have happened with only 1. And the question of our Mishnah is, well, why did the Almighty create the world the way He did? If you think about it, it's kind of a strange question. What are we proposing here? God should have created the world in a different way? What exactly is the alternative? So the Rambam, he says that it could have been created as follows. And God said, let there be light, let there be man, let there be this, let there be that. It could have bunched all the and God said's into one statement. And the fact that these utterances were separated out as distinct creations, that is something that the Mishnah wants to ponder. Why? That's what the Rambam says. There's a very important Maharal over here. And he tells us that the number 10 is a very significant number. And if you look at the Torah, you see that the term 10 appears very frequently. Abraham, of course, given 10 tests. The Jewish people in Egypt witnessed the 10 plagues, the 10 miracles. We have the 10 commandments. The Mishnah tells us that the Almighty interfaces with this world with 10 sefirot in 10 different spheres. Whatever that means, it's a Kabbalistic idea. If you look at the ensuing Mishnayos in our chapter, every Mishnah starts off with a number 10. There were 10 generations from Adam to Noah. There were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. There were 10 tests that Abraham was tested. There were 10 miracles in Egypt, etc., etc. There is significance here to the number 10. And the Maharal explains that the number 10 connotes distinction and superiority and completion and importance. Wherever there is the number 10, there is the indication of God's creation. Moreover, there is the opportunity for God to dwell there. And he quotes a Mishnah we had earlier. The Mishnah talks about 10 people sitting inside the Torah, and that creates a domicile, a residence for God. So what he explains is that there's something very deep going on over here. It's not just that the Almighty did a preponderance of utterances. And the question is, why did he do so many? He could have done fewer. That's not the question of our Mishnah. The question of our Mishnah is, why did the Almighty create the world with 10 utterances? I.e., why did he make this world important? He could have made it less important. From the fact that the Almighty used 10 utterances to create the world, that shows that the world really, really, really matters. What does that mean? What are the takeaways? What are the consequences of the world really being important? He also points out that the Talmud tells us that this world was created with the letter Hey, the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the next world, the spiritual world, is created with the letter Yud, the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And of course, Yud corresponds to 10. So the next world is really, really important because it's created with the letter Yud, which is letter 10. But then he tells us that the letter Hey, the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, the way you make it is you make a Daled, and then inside the Daled, you put another Yud. And that's to indicate that this world is really indistinguishable from the next world. The next world is entirely holy. This world is also entirely holy. But it also has the Daled, so to speak, that symbolizes the expansiveness of physicality, and that's the tension of this world. This world's covered with letter Hey, because on one hand it has the Daled, which is the draw towards materialism and physicality, and inside that you have embedded in the Daled, you have letter Yud, which is to symbolize total holiness, total perfection, total purity, a total replica of the world to come. And the challenge and the tension of this world is that we are drawn both to its physicality and to the physical material allure of the world. And embedded in it, we also have the opportunity to make this world a complete replica of the next world. So our Mishnah is talking about the world being created with 10 utterances. That's not just the count, how many times the Almighty said something to create the world, but the 10 utterances indicate and signify the importance of this world. And the question is why? The world could have been created and mattered less, but that's not what the Almighty wanted. And the reason we're told here is that this world is important, and the consequences of that importance are the fact that we have a say in the trajectory of this world. We determine if this world is going to be upheld or it's going to be destroyed. This world is a partnership. They might have created it with 10 utterances, but the choice of whether or not we continue this world, we uphold this world, we strengthen and nourish this world, or we allow it to wither and die, or we allow it to go by the wayside, or we allow it to be destroyed, that part of creation, well, that's in our hands. And therefore, they might have created a very important and valuable and significant world, and then he gave it off to our fallible hands to decide what to do with it. And if we're righteous, then we're going to have great reward because we're perpetuating and we're maintaining and we're sustaining and nourishing a very valuable world. And God forbid if we choose to become wicked and to ignore the, so to speak, 10, the power, the yud of this world, well then we are going to be responsible for destroying this world. The way I like to think of this is everyone has a job, but some people's job are just more important than other people's job. If you're Neil Armstrong and you're trying to land the moon rover, well, that's really important because if you fail, people are going to die. The mission's going to fail. It's going to be a disaster. If you are a physician and there's life and death in your hands, it's really important. You know, if you're a paper pusher, maybe your job is less important. What if you're the serviceman who's in charge of the nuclear football? How important is your job? The entire world is almost in your hands. That's what this Mishnah is telling us. We were given the nuclear football. We could have been given some other responsibility, some other mission that's not so important. The man could have said the world's not so important. I'm not creating. We'll create it with one utterance. Make it less important. Make it less serious. But no, he created with 10 utterances. He created with this abundance of holiness and value and importance. And then he said, it's your job to maintain it. It could have been moderately important, but no, it's exceedingly, inordinately important. And it's in our hands. Are we going to uphold the world? Are we going to maintain the world? Are we going to sustain the world? Are we going to destroy it? We are bearers of the nuclear football. The Talmud, the book of Kiddushin, on page 40a, going into 40b, tells us that a person should always view themselves as if they are half righteous and half wicked. Half of your deeds are mitzvos and half of them are sins. You're exactly 50-50. Moreover, the entire world is exactly 50-50. Half of the cumulative deeds of all of humanity are righteous, and half of the cumulative deeds of all of humanity are wicked. And the next decision you make is going to determine not only your destiny, but the destiny of all of mankind, and thus all of existence, all of finite existence. Because all of finite existence is only because of man. And your decision right now is going to determine the direction that the world goes. Same idea. You're holding the nuclear football. The entire world, all of humanity, hinges upon your decision. That is the lesson of this Mishnah. Everything we do matters supremely. The Talmud tells us, if you look at the Genesis narrative, by Yom Hashishi, on the sixth day, Vayerev, Vayevoker, Yom Hashishi, the sixth day. The Talmud points out that it adds an extra letter. It could have said Yom Shishi, the sixth day. It says the sixth day. It explains the Talmud that the sixth day of creation is the last day where the Almighty is creating something. But there's another sixth day to come. And that is the sixth day of the month of Sivan, the day of the giving the Torah at Sinai. It explains the Talmud, the Almighty made a condition in creation. The Almighty creates the world on condition, provided that we accept the Torah. The world was not complete until Sinai. You have the Genesis creation, and then you have the completion of that creation at Sinai. And the Almighty made the condition. If the Jewish people accept the Torah, if they take the tools to maintain and perpetuate this world, to perfect this world, to uphold this world, to nurture, to sustain this world, then the world will endure. You fulfilled your part of the deal, I'll keep my part. But in the event the Jewish people reject Torah, if we reject the tools to uphold and maintain the world, then you have not fulfilled your condition, and therefore I'm not creating the world. And therefore I'm going to retroactively destroy the world. And that's the idea of this Mishnah. The Almighty created the world, but it's not complete. We are the partners. Our choices determine whether the world is going to endure or it's going to be destroyed. And this matters a lot. This is the nuclear football. We're in charge, and our choices are going to reverberate for all of eternity. And if we're righteous, think about what that means. The most important job ever given to any person is given to me, it's given to you, it's given to every person you know. And we have a say to determine what happens. And the Almighty gives us the tools to do what we need to do. And what if we fail? If we fail, then we are reneging upon our side of the deal. The money says, okay, you don't want to keep up this world? We'll destroy it. And the morale points out that suppose you have 100 righteous people and there's one wicked person. Well, then the 100 righteous people will override the one wicked person and the world will not be destroyed. And therefore, how can you tell the wicked person, hey, if you don't uphold the world, you're going to destroy the world? Well, don't we see the world's not being destroyed? And therefore, he says like this. He says, every person is judged as an individual. If you were the only person in the world, how would the world look like? If everyone was like you, what would the world be? If you're a good person, if you're a moral person, if you're a righteous person, if you're even a pious person, and everyone in the world is like that, well, there's no more war, there's no more crime. It's just a beautiful world. And therefore, you are going to be judged as a total individual, and everyone else is going to be abstracted from that calculation. And in the eyes of God, the world was upheld because of you. Conversely, if you're a wicked person, you are also judged as an individual, and in the event that your behavior is one that warrants the world to be destroyed, it's considered as if the world was destroyed due to you. And that is a very unfortunate designation. So that's this Mishnah. It's a beautiful idea that really hammers home the message that we matter. Our choices matter. The Almighty created the world, but it's on condition. It's conditional to us accepting our part of this bargain, and that is that we are going to do whatever we can to maintain, perpetuate, and uphold this world. We are going to do our job, and this is a very important job. This is a job that everything hinges upon, and this world really does matter. It's not one that the Almighty says, you know what, we'll start off again. It's not so important. The Almighty instantly could create a brand new universe, no problem. But no, he cares about this world. He said, I'm going to spend and dedicate 10 utterances to create this world. I'm going to record it great importance. This world matters to me. And humanity, you have the keys in your hand to determine which way the world goes, what power, and of course, what responsibility for us to make sure that we are doing whatever it is that we can to maintain and perpetuate and uphold the world and be the people that can say, we deserve reward for upholding the world that was created with 10 utterances. I thank you all for listening. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. I look forward to your questions, your comments, and your feedback.